My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 43 years old, and for the last 11 years, I've been the silent engine behind Halcyon Steelworks' entire IT backbone. Not that you'd ever hear my name mentioned in an earnings report or shareholder meeting. If you've ever felt like your loyalty was used against you, or that your silence was mistaken for weakness, please subscribe, like, and share this story. You're not alone. It started with a lunch invitation. Max Halcyon, our polished CEO, asked me to meet him at Bella Ordo, the kind of Italian restaurant where they fold your napkin when you step away. I knew the place wasn't for casual meals. It was where things ended. "Marcus, you've been essential to this company," Max said, smiling over a plate of veal marsala. "But we're moving in a new direction." Translation: you're being replaced. I took a sip of water and nodded. "These things happen," I replied, like a man commenting on the weather. He seemed relieved I wasn't causing a scene. What Max didn't know was that I had seen this coming months ago. Buried in access logs, in canceled meetings, in whispers in the hallway. They weren't just moving in a new direction. They were preparing to mine everything I'd built and erase me from the blueprint. So I smiled and signed the NDA he slid across the table. I even shook his hand. But inside, something else had already begun. I wasn't supposed to stay at Halcyon this long. Back in 2012, I took the job as a stopgap after my divorce. Something to anchor me while my life unraveled quietly behind the scenes. I'd moved from Cincinnati to Fairford for my wife's grad program. When she left, she did it with a note on the kitchen counter. No fights, no drama. Just, we want different things now. I was sleeping on my cousin's pull-out couch when Halcyon called. Their servers had just been crippled by ransomware, and their last IT manager had quit mid-crisis. What they needed was duct tape. What I saw was potential. Their entire steel production line, worth millions, was running on decade-old systems held together by bad passwords and luck. I sketched out a 5-year overhaul plan, half expecting them to laugh. Max didn't. He gave me a budget and disappeared from my way. For the next 3 years, I lived in the server rooms. I rebuilt every network, trained every technician, and installed fail-safes no one else had thought to ask for. When the regional power grid failed in 2016, Halcyon was the only plant still running. That's when they noticed me. My budget tripled. I hired a team, people like Jamal, who could reverse engineer anything, and Priya, whose attention to detail kept everything from falling apart. Together, we didn't just support the plant, we became the reason it ran without fail. And slowly, somewhere between all-night patch deployments and emergency recovery drills, this place became mine. Not on paper, but in every way that mattered. The first crack appeared last October. A consultant showed up out of nowhere, badge clipped to his collar, asking basic questions about system configurations I had personally designed. When I asked who authorized the audit, he mumbled something about executive directives and quickly changed the subject. That same week, my access to board meeting folders vanished from the internal drive. The note said routine cleanup, but I knew better. It was the kind of digital erasure that didn't just tidy up, it prepped for removal. Then Max started canceling our weekly syncs. Always polite excuses. Unexpected travel. Urgent vendor calls. But one after another, week after week. He used to count on me to translate the tech into boardroom language. Now, I was just another email he skipped. At the leadership retreat in early January, I overheard Max talking poolside about his godson graduating from Stanford. "He's a prodigy," he bragged. "Cloud-native thinker, worked with a robotics startup in Palo Alto. The industry is chasing him." I smiled politely, not knowing yet that the chase would end in my own office. The final sign came from Priya. She pulled me aside after a morning meeting, concern shadowing her usually steady voice. They invited me to a strategic planning session you should have led, she said. And when I asked about you, Max changed the subject. Something shifted in me that day. I didn't panic. I didn't even get angry. I just knew. They weren't planning around me, they were planning without me. And in corporate terms, that's the same thing. 2 days after that lunch, I stayed late. Later than usual. Most of the plant had gone quiet. The hum of servers and the soft hiss of cooling fans, the only sounds in the building. The server room had always been my sanctuary, the one place where everything made sense. I'd selected every rack, every redundant array, every sensor and firewall. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was identity. That's when he walked in. Clean cut, blazer over a turtleneck, watch worth more than my truck. I recognized him immediately from Max's retreat photos. Noah Callahan, the Godson. Mid-20s, confident stride, like the building already had his name on it. Didn't mean to interrupt, he said, stepping into the room like it was already his domain. Just getting a feel for the place. You need something? I asked, keeping my tone even. He smiled. Max said you'd be showing me around soon. I didn't respond. He scanned the main board like it was a museum exhibit. Impressive setup, he nodded. Bit dated but solid. Dated? I'd upgraded the architecture less than a year ago. He continued casually. Your documentation is thorough. I've been reading through your failover protocols. Got some thoughts on how we might modernize it all. He said it like a favor. I nodded slowly. Looking forward to hearing them. The words burned in my throat. Later that night, I pulled up the admin logs. His credentials had been created 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks before that lunch with Max. Full top-level access. He'd already downloaded my entire documentation library. They weren't just replacing me. They'd already started copying me. I didn't go home that night. Drove instead, past the river, past the city limits, to the old marina where Lena and I used to sit in the early years, before graduate school, before everything cracked. The lake was dark, still half frozen under the February sky. And I sat staring at the reflection of street lamps in the black water, asking myself what hurt more, the betrayal or how unsurprised I was. The next morning, I texted Jamal. 6:30, Joe's Cafe, just us. He was already there when I arrived. Hoodie pulled low, eyes tired. I didn't waste time. They're phasing me out, I said. He didn't flinch, just nodded, slow. Yeah, I figured. They've been asking me weird stuff. How the diagnostic loop works, how to reset the vendor interface. Things only you handle. My stomach tightened. How long? A couple weeks. He looked down. I should have told you. I waved it off. I didn't blame him. Jamal had kids, a mortgage, he needed to survive. And he asked, so what's your move? For the first time in weeks, I felt it. Clarity. It came not as a plan, but as a principle. They think it's all in the documentation, I said quietly. But we both know it's not. Jamal leaned forward, understanding. The diagnostic patches, the real-time sync mod. I nodded. The proprietary backend tools, the pieces no one else knows how to touch because they were never part of the manual. I'm not going to sabotage anything, I added. But I'm not going to hand over what's mine either. He didn't hesitate. What do you need? I need a full copy of everything I personally developed, I said. And I need to know who's still loyal. He nodded again. In that booth, over burnt coffee and morning frost, the resistance quietly began. The announcement came that Thursday, during the company-wide all-hands meeting. Max stood at the front of the main conference hall, flanked by HR and a few senior execs, doing his usual performance. Firm voice, confident posture. A masterclass in corporate spin. We're entering a bold new chapter at Halcyon, he said. A time for fresh vision, digital innovation. And there he was, Noah Callahan, standing beside him in a tailored blazer, nodding politely like he hadn't just walked into the heart of a system he barely understood. Marcus Reed has been instrumental in building our IT infrastructure. Max continued, eyes skimming past me like I was a chair. And we're deeply grateful for his contributions as we begin a transition to Noah's leadership over the next 6 weeks. I didn't react. No eye roll, no clenched jaw, just a nod, barely perceptible. But from across the room, Priya's eyes found mine. Her expression asked a silent question I couldn't answer yet. The room buzzed with whispered confusion, heads turning. My team had no idea. Later that afternoon, I formally requested a sit-down with HR and Max. Diane from legal slid a crisp folder across the table. "Company policy is clear," she said, almost apologetic. "Any systems developed during your employment belong to Halcyon." "Not all of them," I replied, flipping to the licensing clause. "The SyncCore interface was built 8 months before I joined. It was licensed, not transferred." Max shifted in his chair. "That was over a decade ago, Marcus. Things have changed." "So has SyncCore," I said evenly. "Every major update, every real-time module, all built on my original code base." I leaned forward, voice low but steady. "I'm not here to fight. I just want fair recognition for my work." Max didn't answer right away, but I saw it in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a conversation. This was going to be a war. The very next morning, I logged in to find my access to the development servers had been restricted. A cold, automated email sat in my inbox. "Temporary security protocol during transition period." I stared at it for a long time. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. By mid-afternoon, Noah called a team meeting without inviting me. I showed up anyway. He was already at the whiteboard in the operations hub, diagramming something he called a streamlined network plan. The kind of buzzword-heavy nonsense consultants pitch when they haven't read a single line of your code. "Marcus," he said with mock warmth when I leaned against the doorframe. "Glad you could join us. Just walking through some proposed changes." "Which system, specifically?" I asked. "The primary production floor nodes," he said like it was obvious. "We're going to flatten the protocol layers and automate the load balancing." I kept my voice calm. "Those protocols aren't arbitrary. They were built after the overheating incident in 2018. You streamline them, and machines fail under peak demand." Noah's smile flickered. "Modern systems don't need those kinds of patches." "They're not patches," Priya cut in, her voice firm. "They're safeguards. Marcus designed them when the floor nearly melted down during triple shift output." Silence followed. Noah recovered, barely. "I appreciate the historical perspective," he said briskly. "But we're moving forward." He turned back to the board, effectively erasing me with a swipe of a marker. That night, a legal memo hit my personal email. Halcyon was asserting full ownership of every system I'd ever touched, including SyncCore. They cited a clause about integrated technologies. Attached to the email was an offer, a $5,000 technology acquisition bonus. It didn't even cover the equipment I used building it. But the real betrayal was still coming. The real betrayal didn't arrive in a boardroom. It showed up in my personal inbox. An email from one of our longtime equipment suppliers, confused by a new licensing agreement Halcyon had sent over. An agreement I'd never seen. One that transferred integration rights, my integration rights, to a third-party vendor I didn't recognize. I opened the attached document and scanned the signature page. Max Halcyon, signed, sealed, and handed off. I dug deeper. The vendor? A startup founded by one of Noah's former classmates. Just a few months old. No real infrastructure, no history, just the right connection at the right time. They weren't just replacing me. They were carving me out and selling the pieces. I tried logging into the backup servers that housed my original SyncCore modules. Locked. My credentials had been revoked entirely. That's when the gravity of it landed. They weren't being sloppy. They were being precise. They'd studied my architecture, traced my systems, and begun slicing it into digestible pieces, ready to be rebranded, monetized, repackaged under someone else's name. And I was expected to sit quietly and let them take it all. I texted Jamal. We're moving faster. I need everything. Logs, tools, original timestamps. Tonight. No response for a moment. Then, parking lot, south exit, 9 o'clock. Later, under the sodium lights and the hum of delivery trucks, he handed me a flash drive. Everything you asked for, he said, barely above a whisper. Why are you helping me? I asked. Jamal met my eyes. Because they think we're all disposable. I didn't answer. But in that moment, the war I'd been dreading finally became personal. I found Priya alone in the diagnostics lab, hunched over a console, pretending not to notice me. But her eyes gave her away. Nervous, distracted. You all right? I asked. She hesitated. Then quietly, Noah asked me to review the sync core transition docs. Said it was just procedure. I nodded, trying not to let it sting. I didn't sign anything, she added quickly. But I looked at them. They already drafted modules I've never even seen. Stuff that only lives on your encrypted drive. That tightened something in my chest. I told him I wasn't comfortable proceeding without you. She continued, voice lower now. He smiled like it didn't matter. Said Max already approved it. So it wasn't just extraction. It was reconstruction without the architect. I forced a calm tone. Thank you for telling me. She shook her head. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I realized they're not just replacing you, Marcus. They're replacing how this team works. She looked up at me, eyes tired but clear. And I think I'm next. I didn't respond. I just reached into my coat and slid a sealed envelope across her desk. If anything happens, open that. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Caleb Monroe, a cybersecurity analyst I'd worked with back when Halcyon's network was barely duct taped together. We met late that night at a diner just off Route 14, the kind of place executives like Max would never set foot in. Caleb listened without interrupting, fingers tapping the rim of his coffee mug. When I finished, he leaned back, eyebrows raised. Legally, it's murky, he said, but something's off. Why push you out now if everything's running clean? I've been asking myself the same thing, I admitted. Caleb nodded slowly. Let me poke around. Just surface-level intel, no breach. 2 days later, he called me at 10:42 p.m. sharp. You're going to want to sit down, he said. He'd uncovered SEC filings buried in public records. Halcyon Steelworks was preparing for acquisition. The buyer? A multinational based out of Zurich. The deal was already in late-stage negotiations, but there was a caveat. The buyer required proof of modernized infrastructure, proprietary systems, and transition-ready leadership. I sat in silence, piecing it together. They're cleaning house to make the company look nimble, Caleb added. And guess what's listed as a highlight in the valuation pitch? Sync Core. Exactly. It's front and center, under Noah's projected oversight. I felt the weight of it then. While I'd been burning out fixing systems, they had been selling my life's work without my name anywhere on it. This wasn't just a push-out. It was an erasure. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying Caleb's words in my head, front and center, under Noah's oversight. At 3:17 a.m., I pulled down an old storage bin from my closet. Inside, an external drive wrapped in cloth and taped shut. I plugged it in and waited, heart pounding. There it was, the original Sync Core build, time-stamped 8 months before I joined Halcyon. The code was raw, clunky in places, but unmistakably mine. Alongside it, I found something I'd forgotten about, email threads between Max and me during my first months. In one, he acknowledged that SyncCore had been developed independently and agreed we'd formalize licensing later once we're out of crisis mode. That moment never came. I printed every exchange, documented every file, even old development notes scribbled on the back of napkins and shipping labels. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was evidence. I took it further. 3 hours later, I walked into a patent attorney's office downtown, paid the rush fee, filed provisional patents for key components of SyncCore, real-time device polling, adaptive load stabilization, and the encrypted interface node. Not the full system, just the beating heart. Enough to draw a line no one could cross without tripping legal alarms. By noon, I had a folder of receipts, digital confirmations, and temporary claims to my name. I'd waited too long for Halcyon to do the right thing. Now it was my turn. If they wanted SyncCore in the acquisition, they were going to have to go through me. By Tuesday morning, I was done pretending. I submitted the full documentation Noah had requested. Clean, comprehensive, professional. I even joined his afternoon planning session, answered his questions politely, nodded when he repeated ideas I'd presented 3 years earlier as if they were revelations. He thanked me like a boss speaking to a temp. That night, I met Caleb again, this time in a co-working space he rented under a Shell LLC. We uploaded my clean SyncCore code to an encrypted off-site server. Then we built a standalone version, stripped of anything proprietary to Halcyon's environment, fully legal, fully mine. At 1:03 a.m., I added one final piece, a digital license signature embedded into 3 key modules. The code would continue functioning inside Halcyon until the license expired. 8 days from now, exactly 1 day after my departure. It wasn't sabotage. Nothing would break. No data lost. No systems corrupted. Just a quiet prompt. License expired. Please contact developer to renew. A pause button. A legal boundary. A statement of ownership. Wednesday morning, Noah pulled me into his office. He looked tense, masking it with half-practiced smiles. Some of the team says you've been distant, he began. Is there anything I should know? Just tying up loose ends, I said calmly. We're changing all access credentials this Friday, he added. Standard transition protocol. I nodded. Makes sense, though it won't affect SyncCore's core functions. The system's built to run independent of admin rotation. That's the beauty of it. He stared at me for a beat, uncertain whether I was being helpful or condescending. He guessed wrong. Friday came quietly. No farewell lunch. No awkward cake in the break room. Just a signed exit packet. A neutral-toned HR rep walking me through liability clauses. A cardboard box of personal items I didn't really want. At the front desk, I turned in my badge. No one looked up. 11 years, reduced to a plastic keycard and a digital signature. As I stepped outside into the cold March air, my phone buzzed. Jamal. It's done. Noah changed the admin passwords across all systems. Full lockdown. I stared at the message, letting the words settle. Thanks for the heads up, I replied. No anger, no panic, just confirmation. I spent the weekend off-grid. No calls, no emails. I took long walks by the lake. Slept in for the first time in months. Drank coffee slowly, like I used to before Halcyon consumed everything. Then Monday came. At precisely 9:17 a.m., right when the production floor hit peak demand, every screen in the control room at all 3 Halcyon facilities flashed the same message. License expired. Please contact developer to renew. By 9:20, the first line halted. By 9:45, all manufacturing came to a crawl. At 10:31, Max Halcyon himself called. What the hell did you do? He barked. I didn't do anything, I replied evenly. The software license expired. It's functioning as designed. This is sabotage. No, I said. It's licensing. Clause 7 of our original agreement. Halcyon never purchased SyncCore. You licensed it. That license has now lapsed. Silence. I've sent the renewal terms to your legal team, I added. They're straightforward. Recognition of ownership, fair compensation, and a standard NDA covering the nature of my departure. You're extorting us. No, Max, I said quietly. I'm valuing myself. Something you never did. By 3 p.m., Halcyon's legal department had reviewed every document I'd sent. The licensing agreement, the patent filings, the original source code timestamps. There wasn't a loophole they could hide in. By 5 o'clock, the deal was done. They signed. The agreement included everything I asked for. Official recognition of my ownership of SyncCore. A one-time licensing fee that actually reflected the system's value. A non-disclosure clause sealing the truth behind my exit. 3 days later, I sat across from the VP of Operations at Virion Dynamics, the very firm preparing to acquire Halcyon. We met in a glass office overlooking the river. We're still proceeding with the acquisition, she said, sliding a contract across the table. But we'd prefer to bring you on board. Not as an employee, as a consultant, lead the integration, set the terms. I skimmed the offer. Twice the salary Halcyon had paid me. Full autonomy. No office politics, no layers of ego to navigate. I looked up. And Noah? Her mouth tightened. He'll be pursuing other opportunities. 2 weeks later, I got confirmation from Priya. Noah was out. Quietly removed after 3 major clients threatened to walk due to repeated system instability. Max, however, stayed. Still CEO, technically. But his new role at Virion was hollow. Ceremonial title, no budget authority, no strategic input. A face without a seat at the table. Funny how fast things change. I didn't feel the revenge I thought I might. No burst of triumph. Just a quiet, steady certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just finished. The first thing I did with the consulting check was buy a cabin. Nothing grand, just a small A-frame tucked into the pines near Lake Islay. It had a wide wooden deck, the kind where you could watch both the sunrise and the stars. I hadn't owned quiet like this in over a decade. A month later, Priya joined my consulting team. She didn't ask for a title, just clarity and freedom. Jamal followed soon after, and within 6 months, half of the original IT department had drifted over, not as employees, but as collaborators. We weren't rebuilding Halcyon. We were building something better. We called it North Point Systems. Small, agile, values first. No layers of politics, no empty promises. Just clean code, clean contracts, and people who remembered why they fell in love with the work in the first place. One crisp fall afternoon, I ran into Max. Downtown, corner booth of a restaurant I used to avoid. Too expensive, too performative. He was sitting alone. Our eyes met. He looked older. The crease around his eyes had deepened, and his once tailored suit hung a little looser. He stood, halfway, as if to walk away. Then he stopped and approached. "You won," he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment, then shook my head. "It wasn't about winning," I replied. "It was about knowing what I'm worth." He nodded once and walked out into the streetlight blur. I stayed there a while, letting the silence settle, watching the city lights ripple across the river. Systems rise, systems break. But the ones built with care, they last. I still visit the cabin most weekends. Mornings start slow, just the sound of water brushing the dock and the old coffee machine sputtering to life. There's no rush here, no system failures, no surprise meetings, just breath, space, and memory. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the lake longer than necessary, thinking about all the late nights I gave to a company that once forgot I existed. The irony isn't lost on me. How they tried to replace me with efficiency, but couldn't replicate care. You can't code that. North Point's grown, not big, just steady. Enough to turn down clients who treat people like parts. Enough to give my team flexibility and dignity. The kind I never had back then. One night, Priya brought out a bottle of wine after a team call and said, "You know, this all started with them trying to erase you." I smiled. Sometimes erasure just clears the page. She raised a glass. We toasted. Not to vengeance, not to victory, but to beginning again, with eyes wide open. If you've ever been undervalued, outmaneuvered, or quietly pushed aside, your story doesn't end there. Like, comment, share, and subscribe if you've ever found your way back to your own worth. You're not alone.